speaking of the Middle East, Prime Minister Netanyahu was here. Obviously, he was the first major foreign leader to meet with President Trump here in Washington. I spoke to him after his meeting with President Trump. He is very focused on expanding the Abraham Accords. He believes that that is possible. So after your trip to Saudi Arabia, do you believe that there's an opening there, and possibly with other Arab countries?
I think there's a strong desire. I actually think what was behind October 7th in some ways was an effort to stop that from happening. And I think no nation, no regime in the planet is more freaked out or more anti-Abraham Accord expansion than Iran, which is one of the reasons why I think they were involved in getting Hamas to do October 7th. But I think there's a lot of countries out there that would love to enter the Abraham Accord. And obviously we got to get through this situation in Gaza that has to wrap up in a way that's acceptable to Israel and makes Israel feel that their security interests are taken into account. But assuming that happens, then I do think you're going to see more countries entering the Abraham Accords, which in my mind was one of the most historic advances in Middle East peace in decades, and which was widely mocked by Democrats, by the way, when it first happened. And we've now seen more and more countries, even quietly. We don't want to say who they are yet because they've been quiet about it, but we've even had countries, more and more countries sort of come forward and say they'd like to join as well from the region, including Africa. So I think it's something we can build on, and I think that to me, it would be one of the great developments of this term.
Just to kind of bring us full circle here, it really does feel like the world is excited to have President Trump back in the White House. My conversations, again, with people across the Middle East, throughout Asia, throughout Europe, even Africa, the Western Hemisphere, it does feel like people are, they're excited to have a deal maker back in the White House. They're ready to make a deal.
Yeah, I think they're excited to have a president, first of all, who's very transparent. Like, that's the thing about President Trump. Like, you don't have to wonder what he's thinking. He'll tell you. He says it. He says it openly. He says it publicly. I've never seen a more pro-media president. I mean, everything he does, he wants it to be transparent and in full view of the world. Today alone, as I sit here with you, I sat in on a meeting with President Macron. That was public. And then he had a press conference afterwards with President Macron. So you see that happening. I think people are excited about that. I think they're also excited about a president that just doesn't have clarity, but has common sense. And that brings back a level of common sense and maturity, seriousness to foreign policy, which involves defining what our national interests are. And I know this is kind of simplistic, but foreign policy works best when everyone clearly defines what their national interest is. When your national interests are in common, my national interest and your national interest, that's where you work together. When our national interests are in conflict, that's where the hard work of diplomacy happens to prevent conflict and managing that. President Trump sees the world that way, whether it's in economics or whether it's geopolitics. And I think the world is excited to have that because you have somebody who's not going to lecture them about ideology. He's down to the very simple, what is common sense here? What makes sense for your country and for ours? How can we work together? And if we have a problem, how can we work through it in a way that respects both sides? I think the world's been dying for that kind of leadership.
It really does feel like, too, that the establishment media is missing this bigger story that we're talking about here. I've seen some of the hits out there, critics of yours in the establishment media. I think Politico did a big article criticizing you. I think the Washington Post had this big story about Haiti when about the foreign aid with the USAID thing, and they didn't even reach out to you guys apparently, and then they got it wrong, and we got it right at Breitbart. Your thoughts on the critics in the establishment media out there?
I mean, that's why establishment media is dying. Unfortunately, it's lost all credibility. And it's not, something will replace it. You guys will replace them, others will replace it. That's why we're doing more and more of these interactions and long-form interviews where it's not a bunch of stupid gotcha questions, but serious discussions about foreign policy. They're still out there. We engage them. We also talk to them. But ultimately, I think it's more of a problem for the establishment media than it is for us in some of the things they're putting out there. There is some misleading things that lead to some chaos and concern. We'll work through it, but it's not going to stop us from our work. Truth of the matter is, when you go, I think President Trump understands they're never going to be his fans, but he's already won despite them. He doesn't need them. And we're going to do the work, and we're going to be judged in the long term by what we achieve, not what they're saying tomorrow in some article that's poorly sourced and in many cases blatantly biased in order to create headlines that are negative towards the administration. I think for the overwhelming majority of Americans, everything we're doing makes sense because it's common sense.
And then the last thing I'd ask you here, Mr. Secretary, is just the back on the Latin America question. Again, I think it's a big deal that you chose your first trip as Secretary of State to go in the Western Hemisphere, right? Usually you see a Secretary of State go to Europe or go to the Middle East or go to Asia. Why did you pick Latin America to go first? And it does seem like this administration is very focused on our own backyard in a big way. Canada, Mexico, Greenland discussions, all sorts of different things.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, if you look at one of the number one things that President Trump was elected on was ending this migratory crisis. So if you look at the countries that I visited, almost every single one of them were part of the migratory route, whether it's Panama, where it starts at the Darien Gap, whether it's Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica. These are all countries that migrants were coming through, and in the case of Guatemala, were sources of, into the United States. So our southern border, if you want to think about it from migration, doesn't start with Mexico. It starts all the way down at the Darien Gap. In the case of the Dominican Republic, that's a pro-American government, right next to sharing an island of Hispaniola with Haiti, so they're impacted by the Haitian crisis. They're also a country where migrants and drug traffickers are trying to come through the Dominican Republic to reach the United States, but they're a great partner. So it made sense to go visit with them and talk to them as well. It's the hemisphere we live in. We're no matter what happens, Mexico, Guatemala, Costa Rica, these are always going to be our neighbors, right? They're always going to be our neighbors. We can't move to a different continent. So whatever happens in those countries, for better or for worse, are going to have an impact on us. In El Salvador, we have a great pro-American president. In Panama, great pro-American president. In Guatemala, a president that wants to work with us. Costa Rica, pro-American president. Dominican Republic, the same. So yeah, we're going to pay attention to our friends, to countries that want to be helpful. And that's been missing for a long time. So it's a good place to start. I could do all my meetings in Spanish, so we save money on interpreters. That also is helpful. And I thought we're going to get and we'll continue to get really good results from those visits.